Can chemical recycling be the silver bullet for a sustainable future? To answer this question, I brought in Reinier Grimbergen. Reinier is the CEO of Blue Circle Olefins, a chemical recycling company in the Netherlands aiming to bring 200,000 tons of chemical recycling capacity to market until 2030. In this episode, you're going to learn what chemical recycling is and that it's a diverse set of methods, what determines the economics of chemical recycling, and what the key advantages are of chemical recycling in terms of a sustainable transition. How chemical recycling also can help Europe be resource independent. And if you want to use sustainable plastics in your medical products, there's a link in the description. And here's our discussion. So, hi, Reinier, and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Lucas. Happy to be here.
So, Reinier, you are an expert for chemical recycling, and you are the CEO of a chemical recycling company. Chemical recycling is usually equated to pyrolysis. There are, however, a bunch of different methodologies which all have their pros and cons in terms of cost or environmental footprint. Give us a small and short, brief overview over what chemical recycling is, what different routes there are. And then we're going to get into your route that you chose for your company. Just go ahead and explain the field of chemical recycling.
Yeah, happy to do so. So if we look to the field of chemical recycling, then it is fundamentally about breaking down molecular bonds. That is the difference with physical recycling, where you keep the polymers intact and try to get them out pure again to reuse them. With chemical recycling, you really break chemical bonds and you start to build up the polymer again. So that already explains that when you break down the bonds to smaller monomers or oligomers, then you basically can build up a virgin quality, in principle, polymer. Whereas mechanical recycling, you have to make sure that you get rid of impurities or additives that are in the plastic. And that is, I would say, an issue of attention for mechanical recycling. And for chemical recycling, you can rebuild the polymer more or less from scratch. How does it work in practice? We see that the current big operators of crackers, they have their assets, a steam cracker. So what they want to do is to, for instance, for polyolefins, break down the polyolefins, that the plastics that are used, into an oil at a higher temperature and without oxygen. And then they can produce a kind of oil that they can use to partially substitute naphtha in their naphtha cracking process. And then you co-produce ethylene and propylene to produce polyethylene and propylene from a recycled content. And if you do that in a 1 million ton cracker, typical scale of a modern steam cracker, then X% max, you will be able to do that. And then via the mass balance method, you can attribute that you have produced X% circular ethylene and propylene. That's how the existing players do it. If we look to an alternative route that we are trying to commercialize, that is that you basically not pyrolyze, that you get an oil, but that you do gasification of waste. And then you break the molecules not down to fragments, but really break them down to synthesis gas, which is carbon monoxide and hydrogen. And from the synthesis gas, you can build up the entire chemistry again. How is that done? In 2 steps. The first step is to produce from the synthesis gas methanol. That's then circular methanol based on carbon recycled from the polymer. And what we do is we convert methanol into ethylene and propylene to the already commercialized and commercially available methanol to olefins process. And what is the difference? If you look to the feedstock that can be used for pyrolysis, then typically that needs to be quite pure in terms of polyolefin content. It must be high and preferentially not too many other plastics in there. If you look to gasification, then in principle that is more an eat-it-all process. So it's less sensitive to impurities, etc. And you break down all the substances of concern that can be in your plastic, and you kind of reset your chemistry to syngas and start all over again with brand new monomer production and plastics production.
Okay, good. So a note here for the listeners. So there's also other chemical recycling methods such as depolymerization. So for example, a PET could be broken down to the terephthalate and the ethylene glycol. That is not possible with polyolefins. And unfortunately, it's just a fact of life that polyolefins are the most plastics we use. It's polypropylene and polyethylene are, I think, together like over half of the plastics we use are polypropylene and polyethylene. And you just laid out pyrolysis versus gasification. I always have this diagram in mind, like the further back you go with the chemistry. So if you break it down to monomers, you need X energy. But then if you want to break it down to like an oil, then you like go further back into like the building up of the polymer chain. So going back to an oil costs you less energy than going to a syngas, what you do, with the advantage that you can have an eat all process. You don't need as pure of a input. You just use more energy to have better efficiency. Is that how that works?
You are perfectly right. I couldn't phrase it better. It comes with advantages and disadvantages. But what we need to make plastics let's say, material that is recycled to very high percentages, like 80% plus like paper, which I think is what the aim of the industry should be, then the reality is that mechanical recycling might cover, let's say, if we do our utmost, 40% of the total waste stream of plastics, then we will have less pure plastics that might be pyrolysis be applied or other solvolysis or other methodologies. I'm still talking polyolefins here. But in the end, you're still left with approximately 40% of the mass that is not processable. So if we want to bring the industry from, let's say, the few percentage today, unfortunately, up to 80% plus, then technically we can only do it by apply them all. So split the streams when it makes sense for mechanical recycling, for pyrolysis. And then our estimate is that pyrolysis is relatively a small feedstock that you can use for that. Whereas the 40% we are aiming here for the elephants, the big chunks, that is gasification is opening that up. But it comes at a cost. That's energy for sure. But it also comes at the benefit that it's really, let's say, when you talk about sensitive applications, it's virgin quality that you produce. So it's, if you like, it's upcycling. I like to use that term because you come from waste from your garbage bag that you bring every week at the street to something that is, let's say, food and approved and and that comes at this energy cost.
Okay. Like I'm trying to understand how sensitive or not your method is. That picture just came to mind. There's like Futurama and then Bender just picks up, which is a robot, he just picks up some garbage and puts it in his tank and that is just his energy he needs for the day. So using that picture that you just painted, like how much of the household disposable waste can you use? Do you also use some sort of bio waste? How much, let's say, metal or PVC or other polymers can your process support while still running efficiently? Like what is a typical feedstock for you? Because I also heard a while ago a podcast on chemical recycling and he used the phrase, there's like 25% was mechanical recycling, 25% that is chemical recycling, and then there's fraction dead cat, which was exactly the term he used. So there's like dead cats and banana peels and whatever in your plastic waste in there. How much can you deal with that? Because like real life is messy.
Yeah, I like that. So let me clarify that. First of all, for the listeners, it's maybe good to be clear that we are talking two steps. To turn the waste into methanol via syngas, that is what our suppliers do. I want to highlight that, and we collaborate with them. So that's what we do, is building a facility in Rotterdam, 200 kilotons, methanol to olefins that converts the methanol, so the waste-based methanol in this case, what we are discussing, into virgin quality carbon recycled ethylene and propylene. That is what I want to highlight, that is clear. So we are now discussing the first step, the gasification to produce methanol, where we collaborate with parties that are commercializing that as we speak. And what is happening there is that if you look to the garbage, municipal solid waste, then of course you have to separate out metals, etc. That's done already, and batteries and all that stuff. And then what you're left with, typically, that goes to incinerators, is a leftover stream that is about 50% biogenic carbon containing, based on what you said, on food residues, on a cat or whatever, paper. And the other 50% happens to be then fossil based. So that's already a benefit, because when you gasify that, you already produce basically 50% bioplastics from that and 50% fossil. Then there's another important notion that the listeners should know, and that is that if you gasify, and you do just gasification, that 50% of the carbon will be turned into CO2. Why? Because you use it as a fuel to gasify the product. So you have the fuel, you don't need that much external energy, you use the waste itself as the energy source. The disadvantage is that you have only 50% carbon yield that goes to methanol and to your new plastic. That sounds worse, but that is not the best way. But the good news is that at the moment in the future that we have blue or green hydrogen at prices below €3 a kilogram, then it makes sense to add hydrogen to this process. And then you can kind of double the methanol production from the same feedstock, because then you convert the CO2 also to methanol. And then your carbon yield will become 80-90%. So that is exactly where you want to be. So if you like a two-step rocket towards the future, probably we first stop incinerating waste, but start to gasify it and harvest half of the carbon. Later on, when we get cheap hydrogen, somehow, somewhere, then we can convert almost all carbon from the waste into virgin quality methanol that we then can convert in ethylene and propylene again.
Okay, good. So, what I want to add here is that the pyrolysis guys also do this. So they use pyrolysis, and then the process you described they're not mutually perfectly exclusive. So you'll get a little bit of oil and you get a little bit of gas. So the pyrolysis method is optimized towards the oil yield, and then the syngas that comes out of that, or the gas that they get out of it, that will be turned into energy and fuel the process. So this disadvantage isn't really exclusive to your chemical recycling method or chemical recycling method for polyolefins. It is a common trick in the book so that you do not use too much energy.
And it is typically, if I may interrupt you, it's typically what chemists do historically. That is optimizing material yield and energy efficiency. And that is the trick here, to optimize that entire system.
Okay, you had a very specific number for the hydrogen in mind, which you said is €3 a kilogram. How do you come to that number? And let's talk a little about the economics of chemical recycling.
Yeah, that's a good question. If we take it high over and I look only to waste, then the business model for us is, of course, dependent to a large extent to the methanol price that we take in, because we convert basically 2.5 methanol into 1 ethylene propylene in terms of mass balance. And the rest will be water. That is what we co-produce. So the methanol price is therefore crucial. And if you look to methanol production routes, then if you consider waste, then of course, if you don't send waste to an incinerator, but you take the same waste and you process it into methanol, then the benefit that you get of doing that is a gate fee that is being paid to process the waste. So the business case for waste-based methanol is always a combination of the process costs and energy, but the benefit that you get is the gate fee that you will be paid for. So that is the bit. And if you do that math and you look to also that incineration is becoming penalized because of the ETS system, the European trading system for CO2 emissions, then the gate fees in the future are foreseen to go up. And that means that basically the business case for waste-based methanol is foreseen to become better. That's one element. What we also can do with this, because we take in methanol, is that we can also take in biomethanol from bio-waste, so agri-forestry residues. And then we have fully bio-based ethylene and propylene. That's also an option. That's waste, but that is not plastic waste. It's biogenic waste, 100%. If you do that, then the business model for that methanol is there are two extra levers that you can use. In that process, you can co-produce biochar, that is CDR, that's carbon dioxide removal, which can deliver your carbon credits. And what you also can do is capture the CO2 emissions of the process. By the way, you can do that also for waste. And then get carbon credits for the biogenic CO2 that you store. And if you add that to the equation, then again, methanol can have an attractive business case when you add up all these elements. So that is if you look into the future, what will determine the methanol price, you have to take into account these co-products or co-valorization levers, if you like. And that is what I sometimes feel that people are not really aware of. Where for chemists, it's well known that some processes, big processes, can only be economically viable when you valorize all co-products and wastes that you produce, right? Because you want to make a full valorization of the process that you are developing.
Okay. So if you're talking about what you're doing with the waste route, you said there's going to be a gate fee, so a waste fee that you're going to be paid from someone who wants to get rid of the waste. It's like, do you know what a current waste fee is in an order of magnitude?
By the way, it's very region dependent, but the order of magnitude right now is about 100 plus euros per ton. But it can easily go up to 250, 300 in the future. So that gives you a clue, and then you can do some math yourself to figure out what methanol prices might end up.
What I am very interested in is recycling of medical waste, because lots of medical waste is currently used one time and has very high quality. So I am interested in a mechanical recycling case for that. It's very difficult to do in terms of decontamination because it's usually contaminated waste. So how do we go about this? Like there's either we can derive it or bring it to chemical recycling, or what we also can do is try to figure out methods how to decontaminate the medical waste such that we can mechanically recycle it. But there it's very interesting. So the numbers I found, and this is, as you said, region dependent, and I found it in Switzerland, it's like around 800 to 1,000 euros a ton, what they pay for special waste. Because like the transport and the permits and all of that is very, very heavy on the economic side, meaning that medical waste can be an order of magnitude bigger than like municipal waste, which would line up. But do you know if there's, or do you have numbers for medical waste?
Yeah, I appreciate that you bring it up, because in the Netherlands, we have even, I think it's not allowed to bring medical waste to normal waste incinerators. That's not allowed. There are in the Netherlands, I think, 1 or 2 installations that have a license to do that. And then you end up indeed at these special prices, and that's because of course, safety reasons, to make sure that everything is really broken down. But indeed, if you look to gasification process, that could do the same job. In fact, the gasification processes we are looking at are very similar to waste incinerators, potentially. So they could indeed pick up that role, and the business case for that will look much nicer. And that's a trade-off in the total volume, of course, that we want to access. But to bring this down to this gasification instead of incineration, I can assure you, when you have viruses and bacteria, bring them, let's say, a second to 1200 degrees centigrade, it's all gone. So that's perfectly safe. And then you can basically, again, do the trick of the syngas and make the methanol out of it. And there you go again. And then indeed, what you mentioned, if you have then gate fees of a few €100s, then of course your business case starts to look really pretty.
If you are a medical device company and you're looking to make your devices more sustainable, there's a link in the description for you. Yeah, okay, good. But I mean, I live in the plastic world. You live, of course, in the, let's say, chemical industry world. If I want to buy, it's like, number one is your timeline is around 2030, where you're going to go online and start selling monomers. If I buy a polypropylene made from your feedstock, what will that cost me in terms of like percent green premium? That is a question I'm very interested in.
Yeah, sure. I think the The question is, of course, dependent on a few elements. That's my disclaimer, because we start at a 200 kilotons facility. That's what I'm saying. So that is not a million ton. So we are not yet at the scale that you can compare it with a steam cracker. That is one thing. So capex intensity is for smaller plants, of course, higher. So that's one reason why initially it will be more expensive. And if we say what is more expensive, yeah, that is also in these times, volatility of the price is a very tricky thing to discuss, because we know now it's really downhill with all the prices. But let's say that it is initially double the price initially for monomer. So let's take that as an example. And then it's good to mention that we have a collaboration with Core Petrochemicals in Rotterdam, who is a polypropylene producer. We have announced that. So they can make segregated biopolypropylene or carbon circular polypropylene for medical applications or healthcare applications, etc. So that's good news that customers, potential customers that are interested by 2030 to have 100% circular polypropylene, that they can already get samples based on still fossil today and switch basically by 2030, have their same exactly copy grade of what they have today, but then fully circular or fully bio-based. That's what I want to say first. If you talk about then looking forward on price points, and then I'm talking about what we discussed before here, the gate fees for waste, if they go up like the 800 even you mentioned, then of course this doubling is not the case. I'm talking here about doubling of a methanol price today. And if you look to the methanol production, biomethanol, as well as carbon recycled methanol globally, then the total pipeline for renewable methanol projects globally, and listeners can look at that by, if you look for GINA. GINA is a consultancy that reports every month about the pipeline of green ammonia and green methanol globally. Then you see that the pipeline for projects till 2030 to deliver on 2030 is currently 55 million tons. Now, what does that number mean? Just take in mind that the current fossil methanol market is 100 million tons. So already more than half of the current fossil market is the forecast that the renewable methanol volume will be if all these projects succeed, which of course they don't. But let's say that 25% of 20% does. It's a substantial amount of methanol and at a commercial scale. So that will also bring prices to a level which is more favorable. Now, if I add that up, plus the gate fees, plus the co-valorization of bio-based, plus I take in beyond 2035 to build a 1 million tons scale facility, plus we have ETS kicking in, plus we have PPWR kicking in, the plastic packaging waste regulation in Europe. If you add that all up, our estimation is that we will, let's say, be cheaper than fossil in between 2035 and 2040. That is our forecast that we will be at parity.
That would be a beautiful story. The question that I have in this case is like, you're partnering up with Tucor, and are they going to use your feedstock in a mass balance, or are they going to make physical segregated grades?
Actually, that's up to our customers. If they prefer mass balanced, it can be probably a different price point, but we can do, and that's the good news of this partnership, that the volume that we produce and let's say the line volumes that they operate at are perfectly suited, a perfect match to run it segregated. So they can do it without mass balancing. And we all know, I think that is the highest standard you could achieve. That is that you have really fully traceable 100% bio-based polypropylene based on not first generation, but second generation biomass. So the waste streams. That is what we will enable. That will be the top market, but we will also enable 100% carbon recycled in that way. And of course, we can also do all kinds of mass balancing.
Yes, okay. Because with the mass balancing pricing approach, I very recently attended the Medica and we talked about this, and then we had the discussion, and the question was, it's like, will sustainable then ever be cheaper than fossil? And I was thinking about it, and while I was thinking about it, I uttered something and I was like, yeah, but wait a minute, that's a systematic error. And I want to bring this to you and see what's your take on that. Because usually a polyolefin is priced as monomer plus fixed cost. So C2, which is ethylene, C3, which is propylene, plus a fixed cost. So usually C3 plus 700. That's C3 plus 700 euros. The 700 euros is my margin, where I have all my operating costs and my profit in there. And then the C3 is what I pay for the monomer. And then these prices go up and down with the monomer, and therefore are also coupled to oil and gas prices. So if oil and gas goes up, my monomer goes up, and then I have a higher price. And then what they do is, with a mass balance approach, usually an ISCC plus certification, they just slap a green premium on top of that. Meaning that you're still based or coupled to fossil, even if you are a sustainable grade. So even if you are buying fully chemical recycled or fully biocircular feedstock, your price is still coupled to fossil. And I just recently discussed that with another polyolefin manufacturer, and they said, yeah, but there's no index for bio, or there's no index for chemical recycling, so we don't know how to do it. It's all about spot pricing. And you may explain what the difference between an index and a spot price is, and how we could fix that systematic pricing error in the future.
That's a good question. The thing is, if we zoom out again to the chemicals industry historically, then because the feedstocks are always, and maybe that explains already a bit how it will go, is always connected to molecules being used as a fuel and molecules being used as feedstock. And the price point for the fuels is always determining the price for the naphtha, if you like. So because the fuels price is the big volume, and you pay basically for caloric value. That's the lowest value to me as a chemist for a molecule. I incinerate it and I get heat, and that's what you pay for. And you can also heat electrically, and then you can compare. If you want heat, if that's what you want, then that's how you compare. But if you look to the fuels in the future, then also you will have the same play. Now it's fossil, but in the future it will be, for instance, biomethanol going to shipping fuel, but it can also go to a feedstock, to me. So these price points for fuels markets will always be somehow related to feedstocks of chemicals, like they did in the past. I think that is not fundamentally changing in some way or another, because they are always going in two streets, if you like. And then the question is, what is the value that you can add in a fuel market, which will in Europe be determined by a Refuel EU, the quota, and in the materials be defined by, for instance, PPWR. There is also a kind of quota of mixing in recycled content. So these are similar mechanisms. And the question is, and now we come to why regulations are so important, that if we look to fuels and chemicals, then as a chemist, I want to make damn sure also for society that we create a level playing field for carbon going to fuels or to materials, but in a way that we guide these streams that it is most effective for society. So in terms of the emission factors and basically the functionality that we add to society. And in my view, the functionality to society for plastics in this case, or look to medical, is a very high value. Whereas you can say fuels, if you can electrify, you will electrify. So that value is a bit different. But still, we will see a hunt, I call it the hunt for circular carbon in the coming decades. You can be sure, because it's a kind of relatively scarce resource that will be attractive to fuels, but will also be attractive to the materials market.
I mean, my point was more like, if someone finds the silver bullet and has a circular feedstock that is cheaper than fossil, it's like there needs to be a mechanism that rewards that. Because I think that the word sustainable needs to be adjusted towards where it was, because sustainable is now used as a synonym of ecological. But I think it also needs to be economically and societal viable, meaning you need renewable fuels at good prices. Like the whole sustainability and ecological discussion, if you really boil it down to first principle, it goes down to how cheap can I get green energy? And then like a lot of problems go away, because if I just have infinite cheap green energy, I can basically pump out CO2 out of the atmosphere, because that currently isn't done because it just uses so much energy that it's not viable. But if you get very cheap energy, you can get it down. And this is exactly the thing with green fuels. If they get to a very cheap price point, they would be adopted and used more often, because like I see the biggest thing stopping the adoption of sustainable plastics, even in medical technology, it is the price point. Because if I have my consumable and I use a plastic that is double the price, I have to adjust my price to 20, 30%. And no one is going to buy that, because the healthcare system is under huge price pressure. And it's also under huge price pressure from China because of the whole tariff situation. They can't sell the cheap consumables in America anymore. So they flushed the European market. So European medical device manufacturers are under huge pressure to have the price where it is or even lower their prices. And then you can just not justify the green premium on a sustainable plastic. And that is the biggest entry area. And I think that boils down to, can I make my feedstock cheaper? And then if I have a pricing mechanism that still couples me to oil, I can never be cheaper. The system is rigged, So like the ISCC Plus, it's not the certification that does that pricing. It's the chemical industry that does that pricing model. With the green premium on top, that just doesn't work. They should couple it to some sort of bio or chemical feedstock price index. And then it's fair. Maybe at the beginning we're still more expensive with the sustainable ones, but they are decoupled. You at least have a fair race.
I can adhere to that, of course, and it might be one of the solutions, but let's face it, if you again zoom out, the key question is, and that is what I hear politicians never saying or articulating quite right, is what is the price of not acting? And that's a societal price because we pay that as a society. So if we get climate change mitigation that is in billions and billions, trillions, that's what we get. So the real business case is societally, systemically, is that business case. And nobody talks about it because that's not convenient. But if we talk to true value, if you like, to society, to us taxpayers, then the real political discussion is, of course, what is the price difference in societal cost for acting against not acting? Let me phrase that again, because that is what you never hear, but we pay it anyway. So whether we like it or not, we're going to pay it. And that is what I missed in the political debate, and let alone from other arguments. So that is what I want to make clear here. We are going down the drain as taxpayers if we don't act. Let's fix that now. And then we can go less down the drain if we do something. Right? I think nobody can fight against that argument. It's already calculated by many macroeconomists that is the case. It's a no-brainer to act. So let's fix that first as a starting point. So then we have an issue with our economic system, which we know is already not functioning well because there are no free markets. They don't exist. It's all regulated. So we better make sure that we regulate it in a way that we make our future societal cost acceptable. Otherwise, it explodes in our face. And that's what we will do with business as usual. So that's first. Then secondly, if you do the math, and this is very important, let's go back to my case of my monomer is double the price. And I take that into the system and I do the math of what is the contribution of that in for instance, a packaging for a consumer price in the shop for you and me as a consumer. Then typically in most of the cases, and I can share a Deloitte report on that, which was prepared by a coalition of people looking into what is called demand creation for green products. Then if you look to what it means to the consumer price, it's typically less than an inflation correction. So we are really talking 1% to 2% max. In many cases, even less. So the argument that in Europe, the richest continent of the world, we tell each other that we cannot afford 100% circular products, where it ends up behind the comma in the price in the supermarket, so to say, I get a bit schizophrenic, then they say, hey, is this really true? It's a matter of how we approach it and how value is fairly distributed through the supply chains. That is what the discussion should be. And that discussion is now getting traction in European level at the European Commission, to come to the point that, in fact, and we all know for ages, that materials and energy are in fact super cheap. They are super cheap for what they do, what they bring in functionality and in value for society. So if you change upfront, make these changes of double a price, and it ends up in an inflation correction, which is only once. And we pay inflation corrections every month without blinking with our eyes. And this is only once. Yeah, you can tell me whatever you want, but you cannot tell me that we cannot afford it. And I rest my case.
Geez, I don't know how the word is in English, plaidoyer in German. So that was a case for sustainable green energy and green plastics. I mean, I want to challenge you a little bit on that, because I don't know if all the reports are true, and you're probably much more into this than I am, and this is why I'm asking you that question. I've heard that in 2025, we lost 1 million tons of recycling capacity in Europe. So if all of this is true, and it's just such a no-brainer, why are all the recyclers dying?
That's simple, because that's geopolitics. So the fact that we have overcapacity of polymers built in Asia, as well as a big investment in the Middle East, is of course because the markets grow over there. Europe is basically a flat market because we are a very mature economy. And all the growth of the market, the global polymer production will triple globally. All of that will happen outside of Europe. That's clear. Everybody knows. So the game that we are looking at, and that is what I call a red ocean market. The fossil plastics market is to me a red ocean. It's the race to the bottom of lowest cost at big emissions, because emissions, people don't care about emissions. They only care about cost. Fine. That is a part of the market. But if we truly believe or do what we pray, which is, hey, in Europe, we want to go to net zero and circular by 2050, because that is what we have as an ambition, then there is no other way than the highway to come up with the blue ocean of fossil-free products. Because if you look to the distribution of the carbon footprint, let's take again polypropylene. 1 kilogram per kilogram is approximately in the oil refining. 1 kilogram is in the polymerization and the naphtha. And 3 is end of life. So, and I round off now. So it's 1, 1, 3. So where's the elephant? That's 3. All companies are discussing we're going to be net zero by 2050. Yeah, but that's scope 1 and 2, not scope 3. So we are just, fooling each other here. And what we bring home here is the elephant, which is the 3. And that's also why we come to life cycle emission reductions of more than 80%. So whatever you want to tell me, however are we going to get even near to net zero and circular by continuing having this same discussion like, yeah, but it's too expensive. And yeah, we have all these assets that we need to, it's all fine. But then it's the same like just denying that we are going to net zero and circular. So it's one way or the other. There's nothing in between. So, and what camp are you in? That's the question. I'm in the camp of the blue ocean of future-proof products. That's where I like to act. That others like to act in the red ocean of the race to the bottom, that's up to them. But that's at the end of the day, I think the choice you have to make as a person for your purpose in life. And you can make any choice. That's up to you.
You said a bunch of things that I can underline. Is everybody's talking about scope 1 and 2, and nobody's talking about scope 3. It's like Swiss MedTech did their net zero roadmap or whatever they call it. And they did an analysis with 7 MedTech companies. And 1, 2, 3, guess how much was scope 3? It was 95%. And 43% is use of products sold, which is basically energy. So it's like if you have an electrical product that uses energy, that's usually the biggest part of your product. Duh. And then it's 48% materials. 48% materials. So half of your CO2 emissions of the company is your materials. And end of life was very, funnily enough, not too much of it. It was like the materials you use. That is like where the biggest impact lies. And then if you look at the biggest MedTech companies all over the world, everybody says sustainability has had a bad year. I don't see that. I mean, it's just like the geopolitics, they're difficult, they're distracting from the priorities. But last year I checked, like with the 100 biggest companies, I do this every year, and I look who has subscribed or committed to the Science-Based Target Initiative or has verified targets. And is like last year was 39 and this year was 49 companies. So 10 companies of the biggest 100 MedTech companies have committed, meaning that we have over 60% of the MedTech market now committed to science-based target. And science-based target basically forces your suppliers also to have science-based targets. So that percolates through the whole MedTech market. And then on top of that, either this is just all blah, blah, or you're going to do something about it. And if you're going to do something about it, you need to do where the biggest levers are. You need to reduce the energy your medical products use in the field, and you need to change the materials and to something that is more sustainable. It's like very recently read a book it was about marketing, very funny. It's called The Obvious Adams. It's just like 100 pages. It's a guy who just does, like, he thinks about it and then he does the obvious thing, like the most obvious thing ever. And he has very much a lot of success with it because it's not that difficult. It's like you take the biggest lever, you reduce that. And there is, I think, where the direction is going to go. However, it's like if you're in the percentage points, like 1, 2, 3%, costing more, it's like that is inflation. Like that is not relevant. If you have to increase your product by 30, 50, 60%, it's like that's not viable. It's like we all know economics also play into this because if you can't sell the damn product, it's not more sustainable because everybody else is going to go to your competition who's not more sustainable. So that is a little the dilemma that I see, and I think we should tackle it at the feedstock route, and that is also why I brought you on.
Thank you for mentioning that, because that is, if you look also to our website and how we present, we always show this tree, like for the non-experts. And in fact, the chemical industry is a big tree. But the good news is the tree is growing from only 2 resources. And normal tree is water and CO2, basically, and some fertilizer. But this tree of the chemical industry is growing on natural gas and oil, crude oil. That is how we build the petrochemical industry. That's why it's called petrochemical industry. The good news is if we do the math and we're going to have the same tree, so we keep our assets, they are not, let's say, stranded assets. If we feed the tree with the same 2 molecules, ethylene and propylene, which do 60% of the tree, that is our starting point. If we change them to circular and net zero proof, then we basically provide a solution for the entire chemical industry downstream to become future proof. And you know what, probably also from your experience, what it takes to bring in a new molecule or a new polymer, that takes 30 years in the industry. So let's forget about that if we want to be ready by 2050. I hope there's a life beyond 2050, and I guess. So new polymers is okay. But to bring them to the level of 1 million tons, like polyethylene and propylene, that takes typically 30 years in the industry, at least. And then you did a damn good job. So let's be realistic. And that is what we did. We went back to the principles. How can we replace oil and gas? We can. That's simple. That molecule is known as methanol. It's basically liquid syngas. If you do that, then you can make the entire chemical industry like we have it today, but it's fossil free. Job done. If I look to the number of projects that I need to execute to make the entire chemical industry in the Netherlands fossil free, do you have any idea how many plants I have to build?
Like for your monomers?
Yeah, for the Netherlands. To substitute the full fossil today.
Probably 8 to 10.
3.
Oh, 3.
Including the small one I start with. So I start with 200 kilotons. If I then build 1 million tons after, then we have a little bit less volume than we have today, but that is what the market will do. So then we end up having the complete chemical industry in the Netherlands being fossil free. 3 projects before 2050. I think I would bet that is a viable pathway.
Okay, but your 2 other facilities would have 1 million ton of capacity, not 200,000. Okay, so I wasn't too far off with 8.
No. I think you did a good job.
Good. Okay, so global scale or European scale, how many do you need?
It is like the math is simple. It's 1 million ton plants. You can do the math, and maybe you can even at some point make them 2 million tons, but that's it. And there's another thing, of course, that needs to happen. That is that the methanol supply, of course, needs to grow because that is the feedstock. And that is, of course, the thing where most work needs to be done. But that is something where we need to convert waste incinerators into gasifiers to turn all our waste into, let's take Europe as an example. We did the math that if you turn all the waste that goes to waste incinerators plus the agricultural residues and forestry residues of Europe, then the amount of carbon that's in there is more than all the amount of carbon that we currently use to produce all the chemicals in Europe. So it fits, kind of. And yes, we need some hydrogen to bring that home. Okay. But it's not like a virtual reality that the numbers don't fit at all or that it is impossible. And that's maybe a nice upbeat message that this is perfectly viable in terms of the mass balance and the number of plants that you have to construct, etc. So that is why we believe this will play. And I'm not claiming again that this is the only route. You can also do ethanol dehydration. There are other routes to make olefins. And we also need still to do the aromatics, which you could over time maybe substitute by methanol to aromatics. That's also being developed. But I think it's fantastic news that we have here a technology that is already, you can construct a plant at 1 million ton today without a technology risk because it's proven technology. So that saves a lot of time. You make molecules that fit into the existing downstream, which also saves you a lot of time because if you make a new molecule, you need all the downstream to adapt to that. And last but not least, it is virgin quality. So if you mix in mechanical recycled content in plastic products, you don't know exactly your composition. Let's face it, it's varying. And also your properties, and you need to adjust your line to produce reliably. If you plug in our products, it's plug and play. No adjustment. Nobody has to do anything. So systemically, for that reason, I also believe that it is, for that reason, cheap. Because maybe upfront the costs are high, but the adjustment costs in the rest of the system are virtually zero.
You said you're going to have enough carbon in Europe from municipal and forestry and agricultural waste to produce all the chemicals, all the fuels that Europe is going to need.
And that is the nice thing. That then I come to another super important political topic today in the geopolitical context. That's strategic autonomy. So what if in the geopolitical context LNG supply is cut off and crude oil is cut off? Then we would be stranded. If I make this happening, we are fully independent for the chemical industry of oil and gas imports. That's what we can achieve. So there's also a strategic autonomy element to this.
And the point is that it's going to be very slow. It's not going to be that fast. Like being energy and let's say chemical independent, that is certainly a strategic advantage that Europe needs to have. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for all of those insights. I mean, maybe a little personal question. Tell us how you ended up founding a company that wants to bring all of the chemicals that Europe needs to a circular solution.
Thanks for that question. I like that. Now, let me make it personal. You know, I'm a chemist by training. And if there's one thing that I hate over my entire career is the bad image of chemicals and the chemical industry. So that is my personal drive, to show that it can be done in a way that it is future proof. So that's my personal drive. And then next to that, why did I start my own, together with Ralf Koekoek, my business partner, Blue Circle Olefins? It's that we felt like 3 years ago, why are the big companies not doing this? And we understand it because we have worked in the chemical industry, and it's basically sweat your assets to the very end because that is always bringing most money in. And you only go to a new technology, if your asset has to be rebuilt at some point because it's end of life, or it is immediately cheaper, which is virtually impossible with a new pathway. So that is why nothing is happening. Everybody is, let's say, captured in their own historic reality, if you like. So what we felt at some point, we both had a bit this frustration, like, hey, why is nobody picking up? Now let's start ourselves. That is 3 years ago. At that time, we thought, is timing right? We didn't know, because I know that this has to come with or without me. Fine if it is with me. If it's without me, I'm also fine. But the timing, you never know. I don't have that crystal ball. But if we now see where we are in 2025 and the status of the chemical industry in Europe, I hope it's not too late. Because if the industry goes down the drain at the speed it's going right today, then there is no downstream industry anymore for me to serve. So that is maybe the most of my concern currently as a chemist, that we as Europe don't act and that we let it go and that we end up in the same situations like critical raw materials for batteries. Like, oh, we didn't see this coming. Yeah, we see it coming, guys and girls. It's obvious. So either we act or we look in 10 years from now to each other like, how did it happen that we are even more dependent on countries outside Europe for our raw materials and our welfare? So that is what drives us to bring a solution, part of a solution, to bring that home, and not with small scale, but at a scale that you have an impact. And that's typically million-ton scale and higher.
That is something that we usually see is like with these bioplastic projects. They're like, oh, cool, I can synthesize 25 kilos a week. And I'm like, yeah, cute. You need a lot more than that. It's like, I like to have 10,000 more than that.
How we were trained, Ralph and myself, at Royal DSM, there was always this corporate strategy on sustainability saying it's about the materiality of the impact. So it's nice to have a small product that's fantastic, but it's of course much better to have a very big volume of a product that is better, because then your absolute impact is substantial and not indeed a nitty-gritty nice to have.
Good. So thank you very much, Reinier. I would like to ask the last question, and that is, what advice would you like to give to our listeners in regards to chemical recycling?
For chemical recycling, there are multiple options. And maybe I close it off like this. We need them all. So I don't feel that, let's say, pyrolysis route is a competitive route. It's not. As a chemical industry to become a future-proof industry, we need the pyrolysis. We need everything we have to move in the right direction. So, and if you are a customer or you're looking for sustainable solutions, be well informed by the people what you're actually buying and what suits the demand of your customers. And then you will see that there is a shop of products where you can choose from. And I sincerely hope that we as Blue Circle Olefins have an offering that is attractive on the short term and on the long term. So that's what I would advise. Be well informed on the sustainability impact, fact-based, no greenwashing, just the facts, and take it from there. Because if you take it from the base, when it's fundamentally sustainable, you don't have to worry about future issues because it's what it is. It's fundamentally sustainable. And I think that is where we need to go.
I think what you said, we're going to need all the solutions. I always say it's going to be a symphony of solutions. It's going to be the mechanical recycling alongside of the bio-based, alongside of the chemical recycling. And I think also like solvent-based recycling has its place. It has some advantages, but somehow we need to make this happen. Good. So thank you very much, Reinier. Do you have any last words?
No, I want to thank you for the opportunity to have this nice conversation with you. And I hope that your listeners of the podcast enjoy it. And let me know if you enjoyed it, I would say, because I'm curious.
Good. So thank you very much. This was Reinier Grimbergen from Blue Circle Olefins. And until the next time.